Greetings from Sabil, greetings from Jerusalem, our good friends. We're very happy to have you with us in another Kumi week, in another session. If you're new, my name is Omar Harami, and I want to thank you all for being part of our latest Kumi online gathering. This week, we are focusing on Israel's use of collective punishment against Palestinians. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by our good friend, Daniel Seidemann, the author, activist, and founder of Ir Amim. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that this session is being broadcasted live on Facebook and recorded. If you do not wish to appear, please turn off your video feed. We would also love it if you could quickly share the links with friends or people you think would be interested in this session. It has become a tradition, Daniel, that we ask our guests to introduce themselves. So may you please introduce yourself and begin the presentation when you think you have done yourself justice.
Thank you, and I'm honored to be here among friends. I'm Daniel Seidemann. Almost everybody calls me Danny. I have been living in Jerusalem for the last 50 years. And for the last 31 of those, I have been focusing on Israeli-Palestinian relations in Jerusalem, which basically makes me confront on a daily basis what Israelis prefer not to confront, and that's occupation. Jerusalem is the focus of my work, and anything that impacts on the character of the city and Israel-Palestine relations, whether it's home demolitions, settlements, or the faith dimension of Jerusalem, those are things that concern me. And it's what I do on a daily basis. So that's basically who I am. And with your permission, I will just get right into this because I think that there are new developments, some of which you're aware of, but I think I should be able to connect some of the dots, which will give a broader context and will allow you to contextualize things that you're seeing. And it's particularly appropriate for me to do this with Sabil, because if there's one phenomenon that I can point to that is new, or relatively new, is the ascendancy of the faith dimension of the conflict. We obviously see that in regard to the erosion, perhaps the collapse of the status quo on the Temple Mount Haram el-Sharif al-Aqsa, but it is increasingly influencing the Christian communities in East Jerusalem. This affects the entire Palestinian collective. When you talk about collective punishment, we're talking about a collective policy. But today the conflict is being driven in many ways by the faith dimension, which is probably the most poorly understood aspect of the conflict by decision makers throughout the world. They don't quite know what to do with this. So let me tell you what I have been seeing very briefly, and then we can open this for questions. Now, I have been following events in and around the old city, which I consider to be the volcanic core of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians for many years. But in recent years, the last 2 or 3, I and my colleagues, Israelis and Palestinians, have been witnessing a quickening of the pace and an upsurge in specific areas around the old city. And some of them have achieved a great deal of notoriety. The most prominent of these, Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. and they are mirror images of one another. Sheikh Jarrah to the north of the old city, and Silwan to the south. Now, to give an historical context, Israel has moved 228,000 of our citizens into large-scale settlement neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, the East Talpiot, Ramot, etc. We did so without large-scale displacement of Palestinians. Israel did engage in large-scale displacement in 1967. I'm not hiding that by any means, in the Mughrabi quarter and the Jewish quarter of the old city. But since then, there was no large-scale displacement. And what we have witnessed in the last 2 or 3 years is, for the first time since 1967, not the targeting of an individual house, but the targeting of entire communities. And when I say targeting, it is targeting by the biblically motivated settler movements in full cooperation, even complicity with the government of Israel. Now, I want to focus this. When I hear the term ethnic cleansing applied to East Jerusalem, I kind of say, I'm not sure that's appropriate. Palestinians were 70,000 in 1967, today 360,000. When we talk about large-scale displacement, we're not talking about throughout East Jerusalem. We're talking about specific areas where the entire community is at risk. And that is happening. And so I think we should focus on where and why it's happening. You have two kinds of settlements in Jerusalem. You have the large-scale settlement neighborhoods sponsored by the government, and the Israelis living there don't even consider themselves to be settlers. They're in occupation denial. But the settlement enclaves are motivated, biblically inspired, to reestablish some kind of biblical realm in Jerusalem. And the focus of these activities are in places that resonate for the settlers, or in general, with ancient Jewish history. So the focus of these activities are in the area around the old city, Sheikh Jarrah in the north, and Silwan in the south. And just to give you the statistics, there are more than 100 families already subject to eviction proceedings in Sheikh Jarrah, in two focuses. One to the west of the Nablus Road in Harun, and the other in the Shimon HaTzadik area, along the Nablus Road to the east of the Nablus Road. That means that we have an entire community at risk. We have a parallel development to the south of the city, and that is in Silwan and Batan al-Hawa, where there are more than 80 families that are already subject to eviction proceedings. And once again, something of this scale has not happened before. Now, this has received a good deal of attention. I actually think it's probably one of the most successful Palestinian campaigns internationally, which has had some impact. It has not removed the danger, but it's had some impact. But I and my colleagues have been witnessing other things. There is a creation of a string of national parks with biblical themes. The Tzurim Valley, the Valley of the Kings, etc. Some of them take lands that basically were on the slopes of the Mount Scopus and Mount of Olives, and some of them are actually being constructed as we speak. And it's important to bear in mind that the National Parks Authority in Israel, which I think is a decent organization, when it comes to East Jerusalem, is the long arm of the biblically motivated settlers. To all intents and purposes, they run it. We have had targeted demolitions. There are more than 80 demolition orders outstanding in Silwan, in one area, Al Bustan, between Wadi Khilwe and Batan al Hawa. We have, in addition to that, surrealistic things, a cable car that is in the advanced planning stages. It could happen soon. That leads from West Jerusalem to the settler headquarters outside of the Dung Gate at the top of Silwan, 170 meters away from Al-Aqsa Mosque. And at some point, my colleagues and I were saying something big is going on here. And what we began to witness inductively from the ground up was the encirclement of the old city by biblically motivated settlers and settlement-related projects, which in a way that we haven't witnessed in the past. I'll just, for a second, take Sheikh Jarrah. We've already mentioned the first time the prospect of large-scale displacement. It has territorial implications. What we're seeing is the creation of a link between pre-67 Israel through Sheikh Jarrah up to Mount Scopus. We're seeing this as a target of the extreme right-wing elements in East Jerusalem. There was a connection between the events in Sheikh Jarrah and the outbreak of violence in May of 2021. And it's not accidental that it spread to the Palestinian citizens of Israel, because what we're witnessing in Sheikh Jarrah and in Silwan is Nakba reenactment. And finally, what we're witnessing is the ascendancy of religious movements that weaponize faith. Now, please don't misunderstand me. This is not a harangue about keep religion out of Jerusalem. No, that can't be done, shouldn't be done. But these are people, whether it's the biblically motivated settlers, the Temple Mount movement, or President Trump's base of end of days evangelical Christians who sometimes make our settlers seem tame. And what we saw in the northern part of the city was happening in the southern part of the city around Silwan, where you're having the welding of Silwan to pre-67 Israel in ways that we didn't see before. Whether it's the cable car, roads, new national parks, things of that nature, demolitions, and the settlements themselves, settler-run projects, and biblical archaeology, things of that nature. So if we were witnessing the encirclement of East Jerusalem, the old city, particularly on the north, in Silwan, we're seeing it in the south, from Green Line Israel through Silwan, Ras Al Amud, to the Mount of Olives. Now, imagine for a moment that the old city is the center of the face of a clock. What we were witnessing until recently was the encirclement from 12 o'clock, Green Line Israel, to 2 o'clock, Mount Scopus. That means northern part through Sheikh Jarrah. And from 6 o'clock, Green Line Israel through Silwan and Ras Al Amud to 4 o'clock. So we have 12 to 2, 6 to 4, and we have a gap between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock, which is not entirely surprising because that is the Mount of Olives with some of the most sacred sites in Christianity. However, in recent weeks, the government of Israel has published a plan to establish a national park over the Mount of Olives, specifically over the Christian sites in Mount of Olives. There are 18 such sites within or immediately adjacent to this plan. Now, a national park may sound innocent, but there's nothing innocent about it. Basically, what this would do is place sacred Christian sites such as Gethsemane, and I need not explain to this group the significance of Gethsemane, under the thumb of biblically motivated settlers. And the settlers do covet certain church properties. They want to build a promenade, for example, that will link their settlement near Mount Scopus, Beta Road, to the one in Ras Al Amud. And it became clear to us that this is not random, but what we're seeing, if I to put it in a few short words, is the encirclement of the old city by settlements and settler-related projects by the government of Israel in collusion with settlers in ways that we have not witnessed in the past. And the impact of this is new. And the impact is the total fragmentation of Palestinian East Jerusalem, denationalization of the Palestinians that relates to the question that I was asked earlier about the shutting down of 6 schools. We will revisit that. And a dilution or marginalization of the Christian and Muslim presence in the city of Jerusalem. Now, you may be aware that was a bitter and very pointed letter sent by the heads of churches to the government of Israel last December, and there was a follow-up, I believe in March, if I'm not mistaken, in which the churches were expressing what they were feeling, but they did not see the entire context. The impact of this cannot be exaggerated. Basically, I need not, again, explain to you what the Mount of Olives is. The Mount of Olives is not a random collection of individual holy sites. It is a whole. It is the connection. It's sanctity in motion. It is where the Christian pilgrim will relive the final days of Jesus in the footsteps of Jesus. And that is part of the whole. And that whole is also being fragmented and the public domain being turned over to the settlers. This contains the threat of transforming Jerusalem into a place which is Palestinians living under our thumb, and the Christian and Muslim equities being marginalized. Earlier, before we got started, we were talking about events at Newgate. Newgate is the gate on the northern face of the walls of the old city, immediately on the 67 border, the Green Line, across the street from Notre Dame, which is owned by the Vatican. And it is one of the 2 major entrances into the Christian quarter. And what has been happening there is under government sponsorship, it's been turned into an Israeli night spot with all sorts of bingo and sheshbesh tournaments, the shopkeepers being paid by the government to keep the shops open late at night and with loudspeakers blaring music, Israeli music. And the heads of churches sent letters to all of the relevant authorities, from the prime minister, the mayor, and others, and did not receive a response. We have the case of the two churches owned by the Greek Orthodox Church, which have been awarded in legal proceedings to the settler organizations. Now, that's a Jaffa Gate, where you have the meeting place of the Armenian, the Muslim, and the Christian quarter, strategic location being in the hands of the biblically motivated settlers, Ateret Kohanim in this case. Now, let me tell you what this is not about. We have terrible examples of clergy being spat upon, on Mount Zion in particular, but also elsewhere. It happens half a dozen times a year. It's terrible, but that's not going to impact the viability of Christian Jerusalem. This is not motivated by a hatred of Christianity. It is motivated by Jerusalem is ours. Get used to it. You're a barely tolerated minority. You're not an equal stakeholder. The public domain is ours. You get the leftovers. Israel has been occupying East Jerusalem since 1967. But in the years after the war in 1967, we understood if we want to maintain our claims, which I don't, by the way, we have to treat the Muslim Christian sites with reverence. These resonate, and that restraint is gone. To a certain extent, it is, an indication Jerusalem's off the table. Jerusalem's ours. I have friends, ambassadors in Tel Aviv, who will go to the Israeli Foreign Ministry and raise matters of concern with the government of Israel, and they're told, no, we're not going to talk about it because Jerusalem is an internal matter. It's none of your business. The churches are much more aware of this now than they were. And there's an understanding that the occupation of East Jerusalem is not only having a devastating effect on the Palestinian collective, it's having a devastating effect on the Christian communities. The Christian communities are already vulnerable, as the Christian communities are throughout the Middle East. It's all, but there were 31,000 Christians in Jerusalem in 1948, out of 20% of the population. And today there are 12,000, which is about 1.2% of the population. There are probably more Christian Palestinians from East Jerusalem in Detroit than there are in East Jerusalem, being crushed by the conflict. So you have already a vulnerable population being further challenged. This is receiving the attention of the churches at the highest levels. But one of the things that we have to impress upon our friends is this is not only about the church. If my analysis is correct, the displacement of Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah, the national park on the Mount of Olives, the night spot in Newgate, at the Newgate, the cable car in Silwan are not different subjects. They're the same subject. And they're manifestations of an increasingly aggressive occupation with less and less restraint. Now, this is unleashing energies that can be harnessed and is making some people aware of this dimension of the conflict, who otherwise would not be engaging in this issue. You may, I'm not going to comment much on President Biden's visit to Jerusalem, which was very thin on substance, especially on the Palestinian issue. But if you look at the president's statement in Bethlehem, he did raise the issue of the significance of Jerusalem for Israelis and Palestinians, and the necessity of guaranteeing the integrity and the sacred sites of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And most importantly, that this is not an issue that can wait for a peace agreement. So basically what I'm saying is we're witnessing things that are reminiscent of what we have seen in the past, but are different. They need to be challenged as such. What we're seeing is not a random group of isolated incidents, but we also have potential partners and new energies to engage and counter some of these, but it's not going to happen on its own. And that is what we should be looking at, I think, in the weeks and months to come. One final note, I was asked about the shutting down of schools being closed. Let me give you a bit of background. After the war in 1967, Israel tried to impose our curriculum, the Israeli curriculum, that was applied to the Palestinian citizens of Israel over the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And there was a boycott, there was a revolt, which lasted several years. I mean, the opening of school in the largest high school in Jerusalem in 1968, there were 7 teachers and 11 pupils, and that was it. Everyone else was boycotting. And ultimately, the Palestinian collective in East Jerusalem won. And Israel did not impose the curriculum in East Jerusalem, and it remained the Jordanian curriculum, which had been in place prior to the war. There's a curious incident that took place in 1996. In the opening of the school year, the school books are going to be, textbooks are going to be distributed. And the mayor of Jerusalem, Omer, who later became prime minister and went to jail in that order, was mortified because it was no longer Jordan. It was the Palestinian Authority. So school books were being handed out to schools in Jerusalem, including the municipal and Israeli government schools, with emblems of the Palestinian Authority. That was an affront to our national honor. So the entire education department stayed up all night putting stickers with the symbol of the Jerusalem municipality over the symbol of the Palestinian Authority. And what's a kid going to do when he sees a sticker? You immediately pry it up. I mean, you're trying to stop the march of history with stickers. In recent years, Israel has been attempting, with a measure of success, to gradually impose our curriculum over Palestinians in East Jerusalem. One of the means of doing that is saying, okay, you are, even if you're not an official Israeli school, you can get funding, but only if you take Palestinian flags out of the textbook, only if you take Nakba out of the textbooks. And some of the schools in desperate straits financially have gone along with that. This has aroused opposition among Palestinians in East Jerusalem, but some of that opposition has been crushed. I mean, a couple of years back, there was going to be a town hall at the National Hotel on Azahara Street, and the police went to the hotel manager and said, "You have that, we're going to shut down the hotel." Talk about collective punishment. The 6 schools are all non-governmental schools that teach the Palestinian curriculum, and they have been shut down and being accused of incitement. Well, you know, you're not going to have Israeli history taught sympathetically in any Palestinian school in East Jerusalem, but this is basically, when we spoke earlier, the fragmentation of East Jerusalem, politically, socially, economically, the denationalization of Palestinians, transforming the 360,000 Palestinians in East Jerusalem from a national collective into an atomized group of individuals, and then the marginalization of the Christian and Muslim equities. So again, there are similarities between what we're witnessing in Sheikh Jarrah and the Mount of Olives and what we're witnessing in relation to those 6 schools. I hope I have sufficiently depressed you. No, I don't. It's important to be blunt and to tell you what we're up against, because this is not a good situation. We're seeing forces unleashed here that in the 30 years that I've been working on this, we haven't witnessed in the past. I'm open for questions, comments, challenges.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. There are multiple questions, but we'll start with the first question, my question. In East Jerusalem, the last few years, especially after Sheikh Jarrah, someone living in East Jerusalem can sense that the toughest generation seems to be our younger generation. They're more hardcore, they're more determined, they're more resilient. How is the situation in West Jerusalem with the younger people?
It's a great question. Recent polls that have been taken among the youth in Jerusalem in the context of the upcoming election is indicating a rightward shift. And there's a large majority of young Israelis who have moved to the right. And there is increasing racism, I say with deep regret. I think we saw one of the extreme manifestations of that in the flags parade, where you had blatant display of racism in ways that are reminiscent of the parade season in Belfast at its worst. And again, talking about collective punishment, you had thousands, probably tens of thousands of young Israelis, many screaming death to the Arabs and pounding on doors as they went through the Muslim quarter. There were 62 arrests. 2 of them were Israelis, and the rest were Palestinians. There are counter currents. I mean, my daughters were active participants in the weekly demonstrations against Netanyahu on Saturday nights outside of his house. And there were a group of hundreds of young men and women who spontaneously, every week, would gather round together and start yelling, "Justice for Yad," speaking about the young Palestinian boy who was killed by the Israeli police, special needs, young autistic young man. And that was spontaneous. It wasn't organized. And I asked my daughter, how did the others around you respond to that? Now, some were left-wing activists, but many of them were very centrist. They said they didn't participate, but they stood back respectfully. But today, the discourse is dominated by nationalistic groups, and there is very little pushback coming from others in the Israeli left. I want to say one last word, because you mentioned the young generation of Palestinians, which I consider to be an exhilarating phenomenon, and one that I openly admit I do not understand sufficiently well. The outbreak of violence in May 2021 is attributed, I think correctly, to events in Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount, and in Sheikh Jarrah, the fear of displacement. But there was something else. There was the police control over Damascus Gate, where young Palestinian men and women would gather to hang out before, mostly after prayers. You have people talking about, okay, let's shrink the conflict. We're not shrinking the conflict. We are shrinking Palestinian space. And part of what is happening on Al-Aqsa and the esplanade of the Temple Mount Haram el-Sharif and at Damascus Gate is the shrinking of Palestinian space. And that's what we're seeing on the Mount of Olives as well. And the spontaneous response was, we're not going to take this, from the young people. I participated in a discussion, a post-mortem of the events this year. We had the perfect storm of Easter, Passover, and Ramadan at the same time. And a bunch of people got together and said, okay, what can we learn from that? And a number of the people there were graduates of Israeli intelligence and Israeli security and the police. And some of them were discussing, these kids were inspired by Hamas. No. These kids were inspired by Fatah. No. These kids, this was spontaneous. These were kids who are saying, young men and women, not kids, who are saying, you're not going to rob us of our identity, and you're not going to rob us of our space. And we're going to fight back. I think we first saw that in the events surrounding the metal detectors in the summer of 2017, but it's growing. So there is the emergence of a young generation of Palestinians who are pushing back as well in ways that we've not witnessed in the past.
In East Jerusalem, there's two camps of people who are pushing back. There's a group that says it's equal rights. There's different, Israel treats West Jerusalem different from East Jerusalem. We should fight for our equal rights. We pay taxes, high taxes. We should get the same amount of parks, same services. And it's, in a way, this struggle makes sense. And sometimes many of even the human rights organizations compare services in East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem. There's another group that says East Jerusalem is a different country, it's a different part, nothing we need to do with West Jerusalem. And sometimes both groups do not communicate with each other. What do you think, at least as an observer of what is happening in Jerusalem, what advice do you have to Palestinians? Which camp should they focus more on their struggles?
Okay. I can observe, I cannot advise. I am your occupier. It's none of my business to tell Palestinians how to conduct, their national struggle, and I will not judge them one way or another. But I can speak as an observer. This reminds me periodically, every election cycle for mayor, there will be expectations, especially from the moderates in Israel and the Israeli left. Why don't the Palestinians participate in the municipal elections? They have the right to vote in municipal elections, not in national elections. And they can influence the mayor and they'll get their rights. And every election cycle, friends would come to me and say, could you introduce us to your friend, the late, great Faisal Husseini? And I would say, sure, I'll introduce you. It's not going to do any good, but I'll introduce you. And the result was always the same. Palestinians did not participate in the elections. I had a debate with one of the great observers of East Jerusalem, Nir Hassan, who writes for Haaretz, who said there's going to be a surge in the last elections of participation, of people insisting on more rights. I said, I don't see it happening, but we'll see what happens. He was right. There was a 50% increase in the voter turnout. It went from 1 to 1.5%. I know the family, the Hamoula in Surbacher, mostly in the insurance business. Now, the question is why, and this is my key observation. I don't think that there are camps. I think these are competing poles of what I witness as Palestinian identity in East Jerusalem. And my friends oscillate between the two poles. Number one, we are not Israeli. Don't treat us, we are not the Palestinian citizens of Israel. The Palestinian citizens of Israel want their fair share of Israeli society, but in a way that's compatible with their national identity. We don't want a share of your society. We don't want you ruling us. That's one pole. The other pole is adapt. We have mouths to feed. We have kids to educate. We have livelihood. We have, and it is my sense that the Palestinians of East Jerusalem will accept from Israel any right or entitlement that is extended, as long as it does not require them to barter in their national identity. Another example, when land was expropriated in East Jerusalem, Palestinians were entitled to compensation. Nobody accepted compensation. We are not going to be complicit. There are changes in the sense that, there's a marginal increase in the number of people applying for Israeli citizenship, but it's gone from 800 a year to 900 a year. There were 6,000 applications, 6,500 for citizenship since 1967. No, it's 16,000. 6,500 were approved. It's statistically negligible. But we do see attempts to adapt. More Palestinians are learning Hebrew. Does that make them less Palestinian in their own eyes? I don't think so. But it means we've got to live and we've got to survive. And there's no immediate prospect of the end of occupation. We have to resist and adapt. And it goes back and forth. Do I see, as a witness from the outside, not advising, do I see what some people call, the Palestinians of East Jerusalem are becoming Israeli? Nonsense. No, don't see it.
Thank you. There's another good question. So when you ask Palestinians, we discuss one state, two state, get the whole land, or so on. So there's different ideas. What are the agendas of the Israelis? They don't discuss two-state solution, and definitely a part of the very few minorities, not the one-state solution. What's the end game from Israel?
It's a difficult question to answer. I would say the end game is exclusive Israeli sovereignty over all of the area to the west of the Jordan River, which includes East Jerusalem and the West Bank, with pockets of dismembered Palestinian autonomy, not under our direct control, but under our indirect control, and in this case, by means of a subcontractor, and in some ways, the Palestinian Authority is a subcontractor for Israeli occupation.
But there's a very big risk or a reality of being apartheid in that case.
I use the terminology of apartheid with great caution, but I see that occupation is not static. Occupation requires increasingly repressive measures in order to sustain itself. And even people who are reluctant, as I am, to use this with a broad brush are seeing more manifestations that are chillingly reminiscent of apartheid. Let me give you just one example. If you stand at the top of Mount of Olives and overlook the Judean desert in the direction of the Jordan River Valley, over Zayim, etc., you'll see a road snaking down from Hizmah to Zayim through Area C of the West Bank. And in the middle of that road is a partition. And Israeli traffic is on one side. And on that side, the traffic is routed to the national road grid of Israel. And on the other side of the partition, the wall, it's 5 meters high, Palestinian traffic, which is a sealed road that will lead them through Area C, but without any real possibility of getting off except into specific Palestinian built-up areas. Now, if you look at that, how can you avoid using the A word? Now, it's not Jewish or not. It is, Palestinian citizens of Israel can use the Israeli side. Doesn't matter. You have one geographical area with two sets of laws applying to them. In East Jerusalem, it's not two sets of laws. You have something else. In Jerusalem today, you have two national collectives, not individuals. There's an Israeli national collective, which is about 60% of the population, and 40% of the population, which is Palestinian. The Israeli collective, my collective, is politically empowered, and the Palestinian collective has no political rights. Is that sustainable? Can that be called a democracy? I don't think so.
There's a question, I don't know, it's regarding Mondo News. There was an article in it that said around 300,000 to 400,000 settlers have been born in the US living in the West Bank, East Jerusalem included. Is this accurate?
I can't imagine so. I'm not aware of any hard statistics on this, but what I can tell you is that there are today 700,000 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Of them, 228,000 are in East Jerusalem, and the rest are in the West Bank. I would say that the immigrants from the United States are somewhat overrepresented, but nowhere near the figures that you're talking about. Now, it's interesting, when I moved to Israel from the United States in 1973, I was the tail end of the immigration that was inspired by the 1967 war. And I mean, we were a generation of anti-war protesters and Bob Dylan and whatever. It was not a right-wing immigration to Israel. That's changed. You know, if you look at support for Israel in the United States, it's becoming a wholly owned subsidiary of the ideological right. And decent folks are finding it more difficult to support Israel. And that reflects itself in the immigration, that most of the immigration from the United States and Europe are from people who are religiously motivated and have right of center ideologies. But it is nowhere near the figures that you're talking about. Settlements are a homegrown Israeli policy that gets a bit of help from the outside. It's us.
So there's another important question, but there's many important questions. I don't think that we're going to be able to answer them all. But are most settlers militarized? That's a question.
Interesting question. I would say that probably most adult males have weapons, and some of them carry them all the time.
Like the US.
But that's interesting, that it's not like the US. It is very much a problem with the increasing settler violence in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, and with the army turning a blind eye. And those settlers are armed, and that's dangerous. But what's interesting is that, you probably have per capita, not as many guns as you have in the United States, but you don't have the mass shootings that you have in the United States, which is interesting. So it's not only the number of weapons you have, it's the gun culture. There are parts of the extreme settlers who, abuse those weapons. But again, you have two national collectives. One is armed and the other is not.
So usually when there is, part of who I am and part of Sabil's work, we're always into activism. And we always have this conversations with the people sometimes when we're protesting in different places. So it's very interesting. It's if you could reflect on the conversations that we have when we're having these actions. So when we're doing a demonstration in Jerusalem or maybe it is or somewhere, you get these hardcore Zionists. They come and they say, your problem is not with us. Your problem is actually with the religious, right-wing religious Israelis who are trying to take off Hebron. Look what they have done in Hebron. Look what they're trying to build another. They're trying to create these biblical sites and so on. And when we are maybe in Hebron or in Jerusalem and we encounter these people, they say, we're not your problem. We want peace. We want to live in peace. Your problem is with the Zionists, not with the religious Jews or right wing, because they are the ones who kicked you out in 1948 and so on. And sometimes we really, we get confused to a certain extent. Reflection on these conversations.
I don't blame you, but I will give you a contradictory answer. Okay. I do not believe that occupation is the problem of the ideological right. The occupation is the problem of Israeli society as a whole. I am an occupier. I'm complicit in occupation. You mentioned the funeral of Shireen Abu Akleh. You had Israeli police storming a hospital violently We have a minister of health from the left-wing Meretz organization. That is his ministerial responsibility. Not one word, not one word. There is no pushback. I think that much of Israeli society is in clinical denial about occupation. But the only ones active are this very large minority who are driving events and driving things. Now, what you said about, religious people saying it's not us, that does exist. I don't think it's a major phenomenon, but let me tell you a story. I took a senior official in the Israeli government to take a look at Sheikh Jarrah. Somebody in a position of authority who had never been there. I mean, it's like a 10-minute drive from where he lives, but never been there. And we're standing around, and I'm explaining to him the displacement of Palestinians in the 28 houses. One of the worshipers at the burial grotto, the holy site, Jewish, ultra-Orthodox, came over to us and said, don't confuse us with the settlers. This is a holy place for us, but we don't want to drive out the Palestinians. And we don't care whose flag is here, as long as the integrity of the site is protected and we'll have access to it, which I think is a reasonable position. That does exist, but I think that regrettably what we will be seeing in the upcoming elections, that larger numbers of the ultra-Orthodox will be leaving that position and joining the clinical racists who are running for the Knesset, and they are becoming more powerful. And these are people who are really, really dangerous, people who have been convicted of violence. So the phenomenon exists. I don't think it's a hugely significant one.
A good question too, I would like to ask you, who do you think uses the other? Do the settlers use the government to expand and to establish new settlements in the West Bank, or the government uses the settlers as a tool to take over parts of the West Bank?
I'm an expert on East Jerusalem and a layperson observer regarding the West Bank, but I can tell you with great authority what the dynamic is in East Jerusalem. The settlers have played the long game, and they have spliced their ideological DNA into the DNA of official Israel. And that means that the policeman at Damascus Gate doesn't need to get orders from his superiors to beat up Palestinian kids. It comes naturally. Or somebody in the Parks Authority doesn't need to be told, turn a blind eye to the abuses of settlers in national parks. And in many cases, the people in the Parks Authority themselves are settlers. That's part of it. The other part is that the government has outsourced many of its authorities to the settlers themselves. So on the one hand, the settler ideology is government, and government has turned over authorities to the settlers. So the distinction between government and settler is very blurred, and sometimes so blurred it's indistinguishable. And that is certainly the case in East Jerusalem. Let me give you an example. If there were to be a change in government in the next elections, and it would be a government that says, okay, we're not going to promote settlements, nothing on the ground would change. because it proceeds under its own steam. Occupation is not something we do. Occupation is what we have become. In order for that to be reversed, you need a courageous government who will actively combat and dismantle this. And I don't see that happening. I say that with regret. I don't see it happening. Even from people on the Israeli left who are friends of mine, who I would expect them to do that, they haven't been doing it.
Last week, within our session with Adale, the lawyers there said that, some of the judges of the High Court live in settlements today. Is this accurate?
I can think of two who do. And to say that I do not, I can say that I can see, it's not as if living in the settlement turns them into conservative right-wing judges. I'm sure it has some kind of influence, but to say the fact that they moved to settlements clearly is reflected in their rulings. Now, I have to say something about the courts. I've had more than 30 cases as an attorney before the Israeli Supreme Court. I no longer go to court. I devote my energies elsewhere. But the Israeli courts cannot possibly recognize the basic fact of life in East Jerusalem, and that is occupied. And they are, when they accept their position as a judge within the Israeli legal system, they basically buy in to the belief that East Jerusalem is an integral part of Israel, and the law that applies there is Israeli law. Now, some of them have consciences and do their best to mitigate that. But it is important to bear that in mind. The courts in Israel will not be our salvation. Sometimes they'll help. The courts helped me get several hundreds of classrooms built for Palestinians, something that I shouldn't have to fight for, but they were helpful. But they're not going to be the problem. They're not going to solve the problem. And in some cases, the government of Israel wants the courts to do their dirty work. I don't think the prime minister wants the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah to be evicted, not necessarily because, of humanism. He understands that it will be impossible to support Israel. We will lose our closest allies. It's simply unjustifiable. But the government doesn't have the courage to challenge the settler right or to challenge public opinion and to make it go away, and they could. So they want the court to do their dirty work and prevent the evictions, and the court have done something in that direction, not sufficient. And then they will be attacking the court for being leftist. Those are the rules of the game.
Final question. There's plenty more questions, 40 questions I see that we haven't addressed. But the final question is that what shapes the mainstream Israeli way of thinking? Is it the media? Is it the education system? Is it the narrative? Is it the politicians when it comes to Palestine and the occupation, or Palestinians and the occupation?
Couldn't you ask an easier question?
Yeah, okay, I'll ask you.
No,
This is Jerusalem,
I will try. Most Israelis don't know any other reality than being an occupier. They grew up after 1967. It's the only reality that they know. Both societies have been traumatized by violence. The Second Intifada was a horrible experience for both Israelis and Palestinians. And I'm not making false equivalences here. Don't say that I'm saying it's the same. No, but so most Israelis don't want to think of it. And finally, globally, we are seeing a serious deterioration in democratic values throughout the West. You have a very strong relationship between the settlers and the dispensationalist evangelical end of days right wing. And they're very, very similar, not only in their ideology, but in the fact that they live in a world that is impervious to empirical reality. They're also similar in they are not necessarily a majority, but they are so focused that they're capable of imposing their will on a majority. So I think that we are in the midst of a global counter-revolution against the democratic world order. And that is taking place in the United States, it's taking place in Israel as well. That does by no means ignores the special features that exist here because of occupation. As I said, occupation is what we have become.
But I mean, I don't think that this should be our destiny. It doesn't have to be always occupier. People occupied fighting for their rights and for equal rights. And the presence of people like you, Daniel. I follow you on Twitter. You're a radical. I don't know why you're not arrested. Israel should arrest you.
I'm not important enough to be arrested.
One day, hopefully, we'll be in a different Jerusalem, in a different Palestine, different Israel, in a different Middle East, and maybe in a different world. It's world leadership sucks this period. You're an amazing person, Daniel. Thank you for being our. We want more people like you. I really get moved with your comments and with your passion for justice. You're trying to make our city a better place.
Thank you. I know that I said things here that are probably problematic for some of you. I try and tell the same truths to everybody. I think in spite of the differences that we might have and certainly clearly have in some circumstances, we have to work together for a common purpose. I, as an Israeli, can say Israel will end occupation, or occupation will be the end of us. And that's my motivation. And I know that freedom is a powerful motivation. You know, you're not going to have a Jerusalem that is half occupied and half free. It won't last. And we have to work together in spite of differences that we may have. And I'm very grateful for you and for Sabeel and the work you do.
And in East Jerusalem, we're determined to end the occupation. It makes it nicer having also people from the other side working with us. Take care, Daniel. And I have an invitation for you. I'd like to invite you over to our house, have a meal, show you the Arak factory next door.
I look forward to it.
Yes, together, and then together we can conspire and on how to make more trouble.
Excellent.
Dear friends, and thank you very much, Daniel, and have enjoyed the rest of your evening. Thank you, friends, and God bless you. See you next week.
Thank you.